Good morning, everyone. Shvuah Tov. We're up to Perek Gimel, Mishna Ches, Chapter 3, Mishna 8. You've got this fig tree. It's growing in a courtyard. The courtyard is a courtyard growing. You're picking the figs off the tree. So the Mishnah says, the fig tree that is standing, you eat one by one and you're exempt. Meaning you pick off one fig, you eat it, you pick off another fig, you eat it, you'll be exempt from having to separate anything. But if you picked two together before you ate, you're going to be obligated to separate shumas and maises before you can even snack. We've had this concept before, and that is that when together, that's considered a pile. And that's considered process enough to be able to say that the courtyard can now be kaveh l'maiser. The courtyard is going to be kaveh l'maiser if we consider the produce processed. That's when it would set the produce to the obligation to the point you can't snack. But it's processed. The sages considered two figs together as enough of a pile to consider it enough that the chutzah, the courtyard, will now be kaveh l'maiser and you can't snack from it anymore. So even though when you pick one at a time, you pick it and you're bringing it into the courtyard, nonetheless, being that it's only one at a time and one is not a pile, it's not processed enough to say the courtyard will be kaveh l'maiser, and therefore you could eat, meaning you could snack, even without separating, the trimmers and the meisers. Now, the notes here in the art score brings down an interesting concept, and that is, I'll read it to you. Actually, if the owner of the tree plans to pick all its fruit now, even two figs together would not become set for meiser. The owner's intention would prevent the processing from being considered complete until the entire tree was picked. However, our Mishnah speaks of a case where at this time, the owner was planning to pick only a few figs he wanted to eat now. So it's very interesting. What you're bringing out here from the commentary of Tosfos is that if you're planning on picking the whole tree, then it doesn't make a difference how many you are picking and holding in your hand if you're snacking. It doesn't make a difference. Then you can pick as many as you want together and then snack. That's because the fact that you're intending to pick the whole tree would make it that two together is not considered a pile. But in a case where you're only planning now on picking the ones that you're going to eat, two together would maybe be considered a pile. But the sage just said, the chutzah, the courtyard, will now be kaveh l'maiser, and you cannot even snack until you separate shumas and meisers. So that's the first opinion of the Mishnah. One at a time, pick one, eat, pick one, eat, you're good to go. Once you take two together, you will have to separate shumas and meisers from those two before you could even snack from it. And that's because you're bringing them into a courtyard. Reb Shimon says, achas b'minai v'achas b'sloilai v'achas b'fiv. You could even have one in your right hand, one in your left hand, and one in your mouth. That would still not be considered a pile for the meiser to be kaveya. If you held it in your same hand, then okay, Reb Shimon says that's considered you put them together, you have a pile, and then the chutzah will set the meiser the tremendous obligation. But he says, though, that if you don't have it that way, you have one in one hand, one in another hand, even a third in your mouth, that's not considered processed to say that the chutzah is going to be kaveya. And if that's how you picked it, then you can eat them afterwards as is. The Tanna Kama holds no. It doesn't make a difference whether you held them together. Once you pick a second one, that's when the sages said that we consider it like a pile, and the chutzah will be kaveh l'maiser, the shumas and meisers. The Mishnah concludes, let's say you climb to the top of the tree, and that's where you're picking them, and that's where you're staying, where you're going to eat them. You can fill your lap and eat. Filling your lap and eating doesn't mean he's not going to be snacking. He's snacking. Nonetheless, the whole idea that we said before, that if you put two together, if you pick two before you eat, that's going to be kaveh l'maiser. That's only when you're actually eating it that's when you're bringing the produce into the chutzah, into the courtyard. Being on top of the tree is not considered being in the courtyard. Since you're not in the courtyard, you could pick as many as you want before you eat. And since you're only snacking, it's going to be okay. The only time things change once you already pick 2 before you eat is when it's considered when you're bringing the figs into the courtyard itself, which would mean you're standing in the courtyard, you're picking and you're holding in the courtyard. That's called being in the courtyard. Being on top of the tree is not considered being in the courtyard. We're now up to the 4th positive commandment that the Chavetz Chaim writes one can potentially transgress when speaking Lashon Harah. The Ima Yidei Sipurei Lashon Harah, again, just to remind yourselves, when we talk about, Lashon Harah is a generic word for speaking badly about people. But in a more speaking badly about what a person did, Rechilas is when you tell someone what someone said or said about them or did to them. Through one speaking Lashon Harah Rechilas, Hishpelas Chaverei, you now lowered, degraded your friend. Because of that, he lost his livelihood. Because, for instance, you did out of the basically your cruelty, your dislike for him, your being not nice person. You publicize about a person who's not trustworthy. We're going to see the situation. A person wants to go into business with someone, and that person isn't trustworthy. You would be able, to tell him under certain conditions. You can tell him about it, but that's not what's news about a person. Just spreading the negative things about him. You publicize he's not trustworthy. Or if he's a craftsman, you say about him, he's no good. He doesn't do the job good. And anything similar. Causing him now to lose his livelihood, you're also now disobeying a positive commandment. The Torah tells us that when your brother is faltering, when a fellow Jew is faltering in his livelihood, he shall live with you. You shall support him. We have a mitzvah to strengthen a fellow Jew who is becoming impoverished. So that he should be able to strengthen himself. Is when he's faltering. The Torah is talking about that when he's faltering, that there's something to stop him from faltering. The Torah tells us to prevent him from faltering. The Torah doesn't want us to actually cause him to lose his livelihood. And therefore, if by speaking Lashon Harah, you also cause him to lose his livelihood, you've transgressed his positive of supporting a fellow Jew who's faltering. Have a wonderful day. Shua Tov. Good luck.